Sources of Islam. First of all, you have the Quran, and this is their main source. I'm going to pass around two very large Qurans. Actually, the Quran is about the size of the New Testament, so most of this is commentary. This is the hardback is from Saudi Arabia. It's from the Cairo 1924 edition, a translation, compilation even of the Arabic. On one side you have the Arabic, on the other side you have the English. And this is the most common one that's given out. It's by Yusuf Ali, and he has commentary at the bottom. So just kind of take a peek and see how it's set up. But remember, it's about the size of the New Testament. In fact, here's one without commentary, and this is one I often use. It's a better English translation. That's almost like King James in relationship to the English translation. But you can see it's just about the size of a novel. And this is by Halim, Abdul Halim, written for the Oxford World Classic. And this is probably one that you want if you wanted to just get a translation that you can understand. But the Quran is hard to interpret, and we'll see why as we go through. Okay, the second source, and this Quran we'll get into a little bit, was the revelation given to Muhammad. The second source would be called the Hadith. This is the collection of the sayings of Muhammad, and there are thousands and thousands of these. In fact, when they were collected 200 years later from oral accounts and written down, one scholar, Bukhari, collected, they said, over 200,000 of these. And he whittled it down and said, okay, these 6,000 that they have are sahih, or authentic, or reputable. But the others are either in between or just fabrications. So most of them, over 95% of them, were denoted by the Muslims themselves as just fabrications. And then I put in the Bible because they do say that they respect the people of the book, because the Christians and the Jews were given revelations before. In fact, they believe in 124,000 prophets, and some of those as messengers, and the messengers were given messages, little bits and pieces of God's word or Allah's word. And so we'll look at those different ones given to Jesus and David and Moses primarily. Okay. With the Quran, this is the main book for Islam, and it's considered the words of Allah dictated to Muhammad through the angel Gabriel, or Jibril, as they would say. And so this is written down in Arabic. We'll look at that because that's a very big question. Was the original actually in Arabic? There are 114 surahs or chapters. The interesting thing is that they're not arranged chronologically as they were given to Muhammad, so we don't know exactly what was the first and what was second, third, and fourth, and so on. It's arranged by length. Now, the first one is an early one, and it's the one that they use often in recitation in all their prayers every day. But the second one is the longest one, Al-Baqarah, which is the cow, and it's written later. It's what we have two periods of writings, they say. Those that were written in Mecca when Muhammad was persecuted, so that's where you get verses where that say, oh, there's no compulsion in religion because he did not have any clout. He was being persecuted. So he wanted to get along with people. So that was where you had 125 of those amenable verses saying we need to get along and you need to follow Allah and so on. So that's the Meccan verses. But they're scattered throughout, and most of them are later on because they're shorter, more poetic. Then you have the later ones, really, which are considered the Medinan ones. This is where he was in charge of Medina. He was the ruler. He went on raiding parties. He himself was said to have attended 27 of these raiding parties where they killed others and raided for the booty. And so he's a warrior. And so you have a lot of the governmental injunctions, the legal sayings, and so on in the Medinan. And you have all the fighting verses. So like Surah 9:29, where it says to fight whenever you can against the infidel and to do all kind of dastardly things to them because they are infidels. You have 165 of those verses, and most of them are there in the Medinan. So we'll get into all that later on. So 114 surahs or chapters arranged from the longest to the shortest, and they believe that these were written down in Arabic by 650. Now, Muhammad was not a reader or writer, so he had to memorize from Gabriel. And so he then had to recite it to his followers. They had to memorize it, and so that was it. It was an oral culture. Arabic at that time was not written down in any book. The Quran is the first book in Arabic. Arabic as a spoken language was, centuries and centuries old. It comes from an Aramaic background, which is the basis of Hebrew and Syriac and Arabic. They're, as I said before, they're consonantal languages. The vowels are not there. I think I said before, the verbs are not there. Of course, the vowels are not placed, so they have to kind of memorize those words, as early Hebrew was. Now we have all these markings to tell us how to pronounce it. But Arabic was not written down in anything much except inscriptions on tombstones and a few scratches of documents and so on. It was more or less an experimental language, as we shall see. So that's the Quran. Then the Hadith were the collections of the sayings or actions of Muhammad, passed on orally because they did not write these down. They say that they passed them on orally for 200 years. These are the accounts also of his daily practices. Daily practices, traditions, would be the word sunnah. And from that, you get Sunni. The Sunni Muslims make up 85% of the Muslims, the traditionalists. Then you have the Shia, where the Shia are mostly the followers of Ali, the fourth caliph, the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad. Ali married Fatima, Muhammad's daughter. But they split because of ideas on leadership. One, traditional leadership, the other, hereditary or blood leadership. That's Ali, and those are the Shia. And you have still today a division between the Sunni and the Shia. And we'll talk about that more later. They consider the Hadith the major source of guidance for Muslims, and most of the Sharia law comes from the Hadith. So we'll talk about Sharia. Everything they do is covered by Sharia. From getting up in the morning and putting on their pants, and which foot you put into your pant first, and which foot you use to cross the threshold. Everything is outlined in these Hadith, onto all the other major worship traditions, including the number of times that you should pray every day, because they pray 5 times a day. That is not in the Quran. The Quran doesn't say anything about that. That's found in the Hadith. In fact, a lot of those things that they do are found in the Hadith. We have to remember that these were not written down for 200 years, and they were said to be passed on orally. So how do we know that they were passed on orally? That's the big question. Now they have authentic collections. Sahih means the authentic. So you have Sahih Bukhari. These were written 200 years later, early 9th century. Muhammad died in 632, so almost 200 years later. Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Abu Dawud, David, in Arabic. So these are the things that they follow every day, as we would have like the 10 Commandments and so on, and other legal sayings in the Bible. This is what they would follow. But most of them, of course, are not in the Quran. They are written down later. So 200 years after Muhammad's death. So keep that in mind as far as the authenticity or the reliability, verifiability of that. They do say that the Bible is important because the Bible was given to the messengers before. So they call us, Jews and Christians, as people of the book, and we're supposed to have some kind of clout as people of the book. And so parts of the Bible are considered to be other inspired books given to people before. But the Qur'an is supposed to be the full revelation, and the Qur'an is supposed to be eternal. So in heaven, there is supposed to be a big table where the Qur'an is etched in stone, and that's the eternal Qur'an. And that was what was given to the angel Gabriel to recite to Muhammad, and Muhammad memorized that, so he's supposed to have given the full revelation. So we'll see how that works out. Okay, these are the three sections of the Bible that they would consider for earlier messages. The Torah, which is the Pentateuch of Moses. And the Zabur, which would be the Psalms of David. And the Injil, the Gospel of Jesus. Now, they say all of these were corrupted. They don't believe that we have in our Bible today the actual Injil or Zabur or Torah. They believe that what we have in our Bible has been corrupted and changed over time, and that's always a good question to pursue. It'll always come up, because the moment you say, well, the Bible says this, they say, well, your Bible has been corrupted. And so you may have to be able to defend it. And that's why that lecture series on the authenticity of the Bible will help you in dealing with that. Muslims believe that only the Quran is fully accurate. Okay? Yes?
When you say the gospel of Jesus, does that mean Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or is that something?
Very good question, because actually most of them believe that it was the Gospel of Barnabas. Have any of you known anything about the Gospel of Barnabas? You go to Turkey. I had a friend, one of my colleagues, visited Turkey, and he said, I want an actual gospel from that you all understand as being the gospel of the Christians. And he went to the booksellers. Every bookseller was given this Gospel of Barnabas. The Gospel of Barnabas is one that supposedly written by Barnabas, one of the colleagues of Paul on the missionary journey. And that Barnabas says in his gospel that Jesus was not God. He was just a man, good prophet. He did not die on the cross. All these things that the Muslims say, well, this is what we believe. And they cite the Gospel of Barnabas. Well, the Gospel of Barnabas, lo and behold, was fabricated in the 14th century. It talks about wine being kept in wooden barrels and not wineskins. Has all these artifacts or what do you call it when you have things that aren't correct in historical? Anachronisms. Okay, thank you. Anachronisms. And so it's full of them. It shows that it talks about the year Jubilee being every 100 years, and the only time that was given by the Pope was the early 1300s. So it's obviously a fraud. We know it's a fraud. We have very good evidence, but yet that's what a lot of Muslims are led to believe is the Injil. So that's why we need to correct that. There's a lot of misunderstandings. When your Muslim friends come over, they're told a lot of lies. I mean, the Trinity is considered to be Allah and Jesus and Mary. No Christian has ever put Mary into the Trinity. But that is what is in the Quran. I believe in Surah 26:31. If I'm correct. That's off the top of my head. But it is in there talking about the Trinity. And it's something that no Christian has ever believed. So there are a lot of misunderstandings. Any other questions before we go on? Okay. Let's look at the development of the Quran. What if the question, this is a very good question. What if the Quran is not divine? What if it's just man-made? Well, if it's man-made, then it's not authoritative. It should not be followed. It certainly is not the Word of God. And that's the big question. If the Quran is not directly from God, then it is a human document, and since it claims a perfect divine source, human authorship would undercut its authority. In fact, this is from an article that's found in Toby Lester, What is the Quran? In the came out in Atlantic, but it's found in a book by Prometheus Books, and I have the citation there. Humphrey states boldly, quote, if the Quran is a historical document, then the whole Islamic struggle of 14 centuries is effectively meaningless. Meaningless. Go on. In his groundbreaking and complex work, Wansbrough, another scholar, postulated that the Quran was developed primarily to establish Islam's origins in Arabia, and the Hadith were fabricated in order to give the Arabian Empire a distinctive religion so as to foster stability and unity. So these things were made up as the religion developed in order to give them credibility and give them equal status with the other empires around them. Is that true? Well, that's what we need to find out. He goes on, quote, if Abdul Malik built up the Islamic religion for political purposes, then the earlier silence from all quarters about Muhammad, Islam, and the Quran can be explained very simply. There was no reference to these things because Muhammad, Islam, and the Quran did not exist yet, or did so only in an inchoate state, a confusing, undeveloped state. And that's what we find historically. For at least 70 years, the name Muhammad is not mentioned by the Muslims. And Islam itself is not mentioned by the Muslims. And they don't even call themselves Muslims until about 100 and some years later. They're called Hagarenes, Ishmaelites, and Saracens, and so on. So what was really going on in that first 100 years? That's what I pursued in my book on John of Damascus, dealing with that, because he was living in that time. Just to plug that, that is in the bridge downstairs and across in the breezeway, and especially the first 4 chapters are very helpful in what we're dealing with. Okay. Now let's look quickly at the claims by Muslims. Again, the mosque will be their claim, and then we'll do the counterclaim. 1. Muhammad began having revelations from the angels Gabriel in 610. These were memorized and passed on to the followers. And what we find, though, is that the Quran probably took its present shape not in the middle of the 7th century, but probably not until late in the 8th century, when the Arabic was finally put into place with all the dots and everything, and people could read it, and you had classical Arabic, but not until the end of the 8th century, which is some say not until the 9th century, and that's over 200 years after Muhammad's death. So the Quran was probably not written as the Quran until long after Muhammad's death, and perhaps not at all of what he said. In fact, Muhammad may have had little to do with the Quran, as we shall see. Much of it may have been written by Abdul Malik and his particular administration, especially this one person, Al-Hujjaj, who is credited with the dotting of the different consonants for vowel sounds. Another claim by the Muslims, number 2, the Quran as a revealed book was written down in Arabic within 20 years of Muhammad's death by 650. But we find that the Arabic alphabet, in which the Quran is written, was not finalized until the end of the 7th century, 6 decades after Muhammad died, and then they had the dotting in the early 700s and onwards until you have classical Arabic at the end of that century. Some scholars say that it is possible that the earliest form of the Quran was derived from Christian liturgy and Jewish commentary, which are called Targum, at first in Syriac and other foreign languages. And this is the most condemning. And we're finding that there's great evidence for this particular idea. It's a fascinating one for me, and this is one that I've been following. These were carried orally. These stories were carried orally and subsumed in Arabic formats. They were Arabized, in other words. They were Christian ideas, Jewish ideas, and they were Arabized, and names changed and dates changed and so on. Though retaining much of the former structure and phraseology, some of the foreign words remained in the amalgamations, and if it's pure Arabic, why do you have over 100 foreign words in the Quran? And as I'll mention, even the word Quran may have come from the Syriac word Qur'ana, which means lectionary, or a book of worship used by Christians, liturgy. So the word that they used for their own holy book, the Quran, may have come from a Syriac word which referred to Christian liturgy, which some of these scholars that I'll be mentioning believe was the original in Syriac and then transliterated into the early Arabic. So, early forms of written Arabic came from two possible sources. This is interesting. Christian missionaries may have been the ones to write down this alphabet for the Arabs because they were interested in communicating the gospel, and the Arabs didn't have a gospel in their own language. They had to use Syriac. Syriac is close, but it's not, and the Syriac gospel was around for a couple centuries by this time, but the Arabs did not have one. So Christian missionaries may have developed the actual alphabet used by Arabs today. Or it could have been merchants developing that script for simple economic transactions, because we have some fragments of those in the early mid-600s. But just very, very minimal, almost like an experimental language until later. Both forms of the script probably were based on Syro-Aramaic, Syriac. Syriac was the religious language of the area, the whole Middle East. And Nabatean scripts, which is Aramaic, which were both developed from Aramaic. Quote, Gunter Lulling maintains that the original Quran was not an Islamic text at all, but a pre-Islamic Christian document. Lulling believes that the Quran reflects the theology of a non-Trinitarian Christian sect that left traces on Islamic theology, notably in its picture of Christ and his uncompromising Unitarianism. So Islam may have developed from a Unitarian heresy in the 6th and 7th centuries, sorry, 7th and 8th centuries in the Middle East. That is very revealing. And there is a lot of evidence that points to that type of thing coming out now. He goes on, quote, my idea, this is Gerd Puin. He studied these documents, the earliest fragments of the Quran found in an attic in a mosque in Yemen, very, very old, early, late 7th century, early 8th century, earliest fragments of the Quran we have, and he studied them. He's a German scholar. And he said this, my idea is that the Quran is a kind of cocktail of texts that were not all understood even at the time of Muhammad. Many of them may even be 100 years older than Islam itself. Even within the Islamic traditions, there is a huge body of contradictory information, including a significant Christian substrate. One can derive a whole Islamic anti-history from them if one wants. In other words, he's saying that these things came from Christian liturgy and text that were transliterated later into Arabic. He goes on, quote, the Quran claims for itself that it is mubin, or clear. But if you look at it, you will notice that every fifth sentence or so simply doesn't make sense. Many Muslims will tell you otherwise, of course, but the fact is that a fifth of the Quranic text is just incomprehensible. 1 out of every 5 verses is incomprehensible. And if you get some good Muslim scholars, they will agree with you. They've agreed with me, and they've told me that themselves. And they will throw up their hands and say, well, those verses are not understandable. We don't know the context. We'll just have to wait and ask Allah about that later on. So 20% of the Quran. Why? If it just came in from all these different sources and they put them together and lost the context, especially if it came from Syriac, as we shall see, there is a reason for that. So he finishes up, Gerd Puin. This is what has caused the traditional anxiety regarding translation. If the Quran is not comprehensible, if it can't even be understood in Arabic, then it's not translatable into any language. That is why Muslims are afraid. Since the Quranic claims repeatedly, the Quran claims repeatedly to be clear, but is not, there's an obvious and serious contradiction. Something else must be going on. What is that? Well, hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to get into that. Number 3, the claim for the Muslims. The Quran is written in Arabic, pure and clear, mubin, Surah 16:103. Well, there are over 100 non-Arabic terms in the Quran. Egyptian, Hebrew, Greek, Syrian, Akkadian, Ethiopian, Persian words are used. These are not Arabic words. And as I said, even the word Quran probably came from the Syriac word Qur'ana, which means lectionary or worship reading. Well, that makes sense. Mingana, one of the scholars of the past, said almost all the religious terms in the Quran are derived from Syriac. It was the religious language used at that era, and so many people knew Syriac. In the West, of course, Latin was used, and the terms were there in Latin. 20% of the Quran is not understandable, even to experts in Arabic. Now, this guy Luxembourg, in a very, very important book, the Syro-Aramaic Reading of the Quran, by Christoph Luxembourg, demonstrates that it makes more sense when it is translated back into Syriac. So he took a number of those incomprehensible verses, translated it because they're both consonantal, and translated them back into Syriac, and it made a lot more sense. The context was clear. And that in itself must tell you something. Some scholars say that the earliest biographies were written to give context to the Quran and provide details that are not in the Quran. The Hadith then were invented later to provide more context to Quranic verses. So these are things that are going on. It may be that the Quran was not originally written in Arabic at all, but was eventually rendered in Arabic as the new religion was being developed. That's a quote by Robert Spencer. And he goes on to say, the Quran itself betrays evidence of having been adapted from a Christian text, and then he finalizes it with this. Luling, another scholar, states that about a third of the Quranic text is based on an originally pre-Islamic Christian text. What does that say to us? It says that a lot of things were plagiarized, though changed. I mean, it's like students taking today, a good quote and changing a couple words here and there. Well, that's simplifying it, of course, too much. Now, this is fascinating here, going into Luxembourg, and we'll finish up soon. Luxembourg talks about the word her, which is the Arabic for hurry. This is usually translated as virgins. The word itself just means large eye, wide-eyed, or lustrous eye. Doesn't have anything to do with virgins, but it's kind of been adapted to that idea. Now, these are the virgins that are waiting in heaven. So these are the 72 virgins that are talked about for the jihadis who commit suicide, and that's what they're told will be waiting for them, because they'll get automatic entrance into paradise. They don't have to go through all the other things. That'll be security for them, because salvation is not something that's assured in Islam. But they are given the ticket, free ticket. You kill yourself in the cause of Allah, and you will get into heaven, and you will have the reward of these 72 hurry. Okay? Well, Luxembourg said that it really should be read as white grapes. The word translated back into Syriac and put into context talks about paradise with all these rivers, with all these luscious trees, and you're laying back and you're able to reach up and reach these luscious crystalline grapes above you. It fits that context very well. Well, can you imagine those jihadists going to paradise and all they get? Big disappointment for them to get a box of raisins. Number 4, there are no variant readings. Lost verses or conflicting readings on various texts. The Quran is, in other words, perfect, but there are many variant readings. Arthur Jeffrey gives 90 pages of this. The book that you have by Keith Small talks about many mistakes. In fact, they're finding, he and another colleague are finding many of these. They're going around the world photographing the earliest manuscripts, and they're finding a lot of corrections, erasures, cutouts, everything else. Muslims don't know this. They believe that their Quran has always been perfect. The Yemeni Qur'ans that I mentioned in the mosque reveal that the Muslim claim of a uniform text can no longer be made, and that's why this book is so important. He shows that there are many textual variants. He's applying the test that these German scholars have applied to the New Testament. The New Testament wins out, hands over. When you talk about the Quran being discovered or written down in 650, we have no manuscripts from that time. As I said, probably another 100 years after that before the Quran is written down in the form that we have it, or some of it. Compared to the Bible, and I will put up a chart showing the dates, the relative dates of the Bible. We have, ours goes back, the New Testament is said to be written down within 20 years. So the book of Galatians that Dr. Thomas is going through is probably the earliest of Paul's writings, written about 49 to 50 A.D., and that's within 20 years. And within the lifetime of those who witnessed all these things. So all these guys could have been witnesses. Right at that time, you have shortly after that, Mark, Matthew, Luke written down. Luke was the later one, but he also wrote the history. He may have even written Hebrews. There's an interesting study on that, his sermon. But anyway, you have all of these documents written within the lifetime of the people who were there with the New Testament. But you don't have that verification with the Quran at all. In fact, it's becoming less and less. So, the best evidence we have today seems to reveal a slow development of the Quran from non-Muslim sources, primarily Syriac, that were adopted and incorporated into an intermediate monotheism that was neither Christian nor Jewish, but which was influenced by beliefs from both. So that's where the Quran is, and we'll be picking this up as we go through, but it's something to look at. And we'll be discussing some of this even next week.